Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I am thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from operators like hyperscale, co-location, edge providers, technology and facilities companies that sell to and partner with data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, as well as construction and real estate and capital investment kind of companies that sell to and partner with data center companies and operators. And who can forget the outsourced sales and marketing companies that are a really, really important, essential part of data center go-to-market sales and marketing. And regardless of where you sit on the go-to-market team, perhaps you're in sales, marketing, account management, product management, channel partnerships, or maybe you're the maestro, the orchestra conductor that is responsible for getting everyone aligned and rowing in the same direction, in the right seats on the bus all the time, conducting the orchestra to make sure that everyone is aligned and collaborating the right way. But regardless, if you're serious about leveling up and growing the role of yourself, your company, your team, within the data center ecosystem, you are for sure in the right place. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe on our website directly at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda? What are the biggest questions that I'll be addressing this week? We're going to start by talking about how to improve lead generation for co-location, edge, and hyperscale data center solutions. After that, we'll turn our attention to how an IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and data center solution provider can market and sell their 40% underutilized capacity. After that, we'll turn our attention to how to market data center managed integration and cybersecurity services. Then we'll take a quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, we will address how an IT infrastructure solutions company can attract larger customers, how a data center construction company can connect with digital infrastructure decision makers. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A live show, we'll look at how an IT infrastructure provider can get more leads and grow its sales funnel. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you like to watch. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question, which is, how do we improve lead generation for co-location, edge, and hyperscale data center solutions? What's the key to improving lead generation for co-location, edge, and hyperscale data center solutions? So the first big question that you need to ask yourself is, are all three of those lines of business, co-location, edge, and hyperscale, the same clients? If they're not, as they likely are not, you more than likely are going to need a different go-to-market strategy and a different sales and marketing playbook, perhaps different team members, to really get good at addressing the lead generation needs for each of those segments. Co-location often is seen as like retail. You're selling you're selling some transaction, you're selling some short-term contracts, some long-term contracts, but you're selling at a price point that on the low end may be not much different than selling SaaS, so software as a service. So what does that mean? It needs to be heavily productized. It needs a super efficient process from lead generation to nurturing to closing to onboarding and getting the new client to initial value, intended value, and extended value, so they're delighted enough that it gives you an opportunity to perhaps land and expand, customer expansion kind of revenue, cross-selling, upselling. But in order for that to work, it's got to be a very smooth, well-oiled revenue growth machine, revenue growth engine. That's very different than selling hyperscale. With co-location, depending on where you're located, once you define your ideal client profile, which you'll need to do before you can do your lead generation strategy, once you figure that out, you may develop a target account list of a couple hundred or a couple thousand potential clients for your co-location. Hyperscale is like the opposite. We're dealing with massive unit economics, like 7-figure deals, perhaps even considerably more than that. And because of that, there tends to only be a couple dozen companies globally that would be a good fit for buying hyperscale data center solutions from you. So when your unit economics are so ridiculously strong, the lifetime value, average recurring revenue, all that stuff is so outrageously high, you can really invest aggressively in your lead generation program. And then it's a matter of realizing that, okay, you're not the only one that's investing aggressively in your hyperscale lead generation program, because there's so much at stake. So competitive differentiation, positioning, all that, building a brand, all makes a massive difference. Edge is a little different because with Edge, a lot of times you're looking to check off a box, meet someone's requirements that has to do with latency. It, in some cases, may have to do with governance or a specific location, but make no mistake, the value proposition for Edge is many times uniquely different than co-location, because there's a incredibly high premium on a very precise location, whereas with co-location, regional coverage or in a local metro area may be okay. A perfect example would be, let's take a data center operator that has 6 facilities in a major metropolitan area. And all 6 of those facilities offer a variety of different options. If you have a client that's on the other side of the country or other side of the world, they may be fine with being located in any one of those 6 facilities. With Edge, not so much. With Edge, they want a very finely tuned, precise location. So yeah, very different needs. Sometimes much quicker sales cycle, different business use cases, a different premium perhaps on density. How many kilowatts are going to be in the rack, whether there's GPUs involved, all that good stuff. So when it comes to your lead generation, yeah, the first thing is figure out if you have a homogenous customer that's going to potentially buy all 3, very unlikely, or you have 3 different kinds of clients. If you have 3 different kind of clients, I would encourage you to start by, once you've figured out that you need to segment into those 3 lines of business, 3 different ideal client profiles. So for each ideal client profile, define geographically where that ideal client is located in terms of metro areas, states, provinces, countries, continents, global. Second, define their company size. With hyperscalers, you're typically dealing with huge enterprises. With co-location, it could be all over the map, especially if it's retail in terms of ranges. But what I would encourage you to do is, when it comes to lead generation, you're probably going to want to normalize based on number of employees in that particular company. Headcount, as it's sometimes called within LinkedIn. That's especially important because if you're going to use tools like LinkedIn Sales Navigator or LinkedIn Campaign Manager, or even other competitive tools to there, most allow you to query and filter based on a geographic parameter as well as a company size. You can also, both with LinkedIn and other similar kinds of platforms, you can also target by industry, by vertical markets, by business model. For the most part, those are usually one and the same across most of those platforms. Why is that especially relevant? Because for a data center operator or an enterprise data center, when it comes to your data center solutions, regardless of whether you're talking about colo or edge or hyperscale, there is oftentimes, depending on where you're located, a very real possibility that you need to meet certain compliance requirements, certification requirements to do business in certain kinds of verticals, in certain kind of industries in that particular geographic region. So when it comes to your ideal client profile, that I would encourage you to document, to think through and document for each of these three segments. Know geographically where they're located, how narrow or how broad that's going to be. Second, know roughly their company size, the bottom end of the range, what's like the minimum company size they need to be able to afford your minimums in terms of number of employees, or perhaps in terms of amount of revenue that you can usually also query in a lot of those tools. And what's the upper end of the range? Is there a possibility that when it comes to co-location or edge or hyperscale, that your company does really well with mid-market, but your close rate, your retention rate, your satisfaction, your NPS falls off a cliff with certain huge companies like over 10,000 employees or over 5,000 employees or something like that. So get really self-aware about where you're successful with your marketing and your sales and your customer success and long-term retention and satisfaction, and define those ranges for each of those lines of business. And then define the verticals, define the industries for each of those lines of business that intersect with your capabilities, that intersect with your skills, your expertise, your compliance, your credentialing. Once you have that in mind, as mentioned a few moments ago, you can use that ideal client profile and then build out your target account list. And then from there, define the buyer personas that are in each of those kinds of companies that you want to market and sell and service to. For example, when it comes to your ideal co-location client, who is the most important economic decision maker and who is the second most important economic decision maker? The most important co-location decision maker, person on that decision committee, we're going to call your primary buyer persona. The second most important person, we'll likely call your secondary buyer persona, depending on how big or complex your sales process is, how big the deal size is, how big the clients are. You may have a tertiary buyer persona. You may also eventually introduce negative buyer personas where you're keeping track of a certain kind of person that if they show up in your sales process, it's not a good thing. It could be, the whole deal could be called into question. So that's your negative buyer persona. And I would encourage you to also go through your other two segments, your edge ideal client profile and your hyperscale ideal client profile, and think through who the most important and second most important kind of stakeholder is. In some cases, your case studies, your logos, your CRM, your closed won, your successful clients will give you clues about who the typical people are that are involved in each of these roles. Designate them and prioritize them. Once you know who these buyer personas are, then the next step before you do your lead generation is to do some customer insight research and figure out, by looking at a representative sample of at least 5 or 10, perhaps as many as 15 or 20 people in each of those segments, either through interviews, Zoom interviews, surveys, studying their LinkedIn profiles, how they self-describe, the kinds of content that they interact with, that they share, all that good stuff. Once you find the consensus on each of those buyer personas' most important goals that they're trying to achieve professionally, individually, as a team, as a company, and conversely, their frustrations, their challenges that they have in common at the individual level, at the team level, at the company level, those goals and challenges are the key unlock to getting your messaging right. They're the key to relevance. They're the key to giving those potential clients, those leads, a reason to pay attention to you in the first place. In other words, if you skip everything that I've just been talking about for the last several minutes and go with what you think your definition of a lead is, and it's not a customer-centric, a client-centric approach, there's a really good chance that everything that you do going forward is just not going to resonate with the intended target audience. If you want it to resonate, if you want to be able to grab them by the virtual shirt collar as they're scrolling by and pull them into your world, exuding relevance, exuding expertise about how your company is exceptionally gifted and talented when it comes to your co-location and edge and hyperscale, it is incredibly important to not only get consensus on their goals, but get it in their own words. Not what you think those words are, but what their words actually are. How do you know what their words actually are? Because you asked them and they told you, and you crafted the consensus together. That's the key to getting a content strategy together, getting website copywriting and product marketing and sales enablement together, and lead generation offers, both educational resources and educational events that really, really knock it out of the park and resonate for the most important stakeholders that are going to be involved with researching and comparing and evaluating pricing when it comes to your company's colocation, edge, and hyperscale. Don't even think about getting started with lead generation until you know why someone should pay attention to you. What is top of mind for them that they're struggling with? What's top of mind for them that they need to figure out, and show up in a way that gets you out of the vendor box so that they see your lead generation offers as the equivalent of extraordinarily valuable consulting. So instead of them seeing your sales team, your account executives, your sales development reps as a transaction-focused vendor, they in turn will see your team as consultants, subject matter experts, teachers, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. That's the key to getting your lead generation strategy right when it comes to colocation, edge, and hyperscale. But you're not done quite yet. It's also really, really important to understand that in the self-guided buyer's journey, which is the predominant buyer's journey that people now go through when it comes to making decisions around colocation, edge, and hyperscale, it's incredibly important that we not only understand who they are and what they care about, but where they are in their journey. By default, most colocation, edge, and hyperscale providers that don't have a client-centric approach are acting as if every person that knocks on their virtual door is ready to buy today. Imagine like somebody going out on a first date and one person sitting at the table was insistent that they get married today. Imagine somebody going to buy a car, or lease a car, and the car salesperson was insistent that you either buy or lease today, or they're going to burn their bridges and all the goodwill out the window. I want to make sure that you're aware of what actually is going on in the buyer's journey, because in the self-driven buyer's journey, 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without you being in the room. This is an enormous difference from as recently as 10 years ago, when instead of you only being in the room for the final 17%, you were in the room for roughly half of their buyer's journey. Those days are long gone. Why? A whole bunch of baby boomers retiring, more Gen Z, more millennials in decision-making roles, even in Gen Alpha to a certain degree. And the early part of the 2020s, millions of people working from home, accelerating digital transformation like a rocket. In order for your lead generation to resonate and give you a chance to frame the criteria that your prospects, your future clients are using to evaluate all of the different options in front of them, it is incredibly important for you to get in early and get in often. A typical journey might have like 26 or 28 different touch points. Most companies that do a crappy job with their lead generation for hyperscale, edge, and hyperscale, at best case scenario, maybe are in on 2 or 3 of those 28 touch points. What does that mean? Your competition, your direct competition, your indirect competition, your non-business model competition are in there. And they're the ones who are teaching, educating your prospects that you want as future clients about how to navigate their whole decision-making process. If you're able to get in early, and your AEs, your account executives, your sales development reps, your marketers, your account managers, all your client-facing team members are seen as teachers and consultants and experts, you'll be in great shape, because your prospects and clients will want to spend time with members of your client-facing team. If you don't get found early, rest assured that if you do get found at all at the end, it is not a very good place to be, because the only thing that's going to sway their decision at the end is the race to the bottom with competing on price. So it is incredibly important, if you want to get your lead generation strategy for colo, for edge, for hyperscale right in today's modern buyer's journey. We need to be super aware of how we're going to show up for the right people, in the right places, at the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so that they see your client-facing team members as worthy of being able to spend time with. So instead of you having to nag them all day long, begging for meetings, your prospects and clients actually want to spend time with members of your team, because they're getting a lot of value from that time invested. Those are the crucial mindset issues. Understanding your ideal client profile, understanding your buyer personas, understanding the biggest goals and challenges of those particular buyer personas, and using the consensus on those goals and challenges to infuse into your website copywriting, your product marketing, your sales enablement materials, your presentations, your blogs, your articles, your downloadables, everything that you do. And of course, your educational event strategy, both online and offline events. That's how to improve lead generation for colocation, edge, and hyperscale data center solutions. Next question up for today is, what do we got? How does an IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and data center solution provider market and sell the 40% underutilized capacity? How can an infrastructure as a service company and data center solution provider market and sell their 40% underutilized capacity? That's a fantastic question. So what I'm trying to figure out is, why do you have 40% underutilized capacity in the first place? Were you unaware that this capacity existed? Was your marketing plan not generating enough of the right leads? Was your sales team not able to successfully close these leads for infrastructure and data center solutions? And how motivated, what's the urgency to make this happen? Because in a perfect world, it really shouldn't come as a surprise to you that there's underutilized capacity. And the way that this question is worded, it seems to me that it was a really, really big surprise that this underutilized capacity exists. So the question is now, are you like in desperation mode where you need to get anyone in there with any kind of revenue, no matter how lousy the margins are, just to get some revenue against that underutilized capacity? Or do you want to like fix this the right way so the problem doesn't happen going forward? I think in a lot of cases, if it's a complete surprise that you have this underutilized capacity, either the ramp time for hiring and ramping up new marketing campaigns and new sales staff maybe wasn't realistic. Maybe the historical close rate had changed. Maybe you didn't have an idea of what the historical close rate or deal size was going to be. But clearly, if it's a complete it's a complete shock to you that there's this 40% underutilized capacity, something is breaking down in your go-to-market playbook. So a lot of what this comes down to is, in many cases, it's not just a go-to-market problem. A lot of times this is a CFO board level kind of problem where the average deal size is not hitting what you thought it would be. And a lot of that is a symptom of a mismatch on product market fit and go-to-market fit. Product market fit means that you know with a really high degree of certainty exactly what products and services a client is purchasing, at what price points, for what duration, and you're also able to fill in all of the basic unit economics for that intended client. So things like monthly recurring revenue, annual recurring revenue, length of contract, margins, average sales cycle length, sales compensation, all of those, there's a high degree of clarity. Go-to-market fit is the next level beyond that. So for a particular segment, you know all of that, and then you know as you're deploying additional capital into that go-to-market strategy, you know with a very high degree of certainty that you'll be able to replicate what has already happened. So with relatively small companies or relatively new market expansion, typically what gets you to go to market is it's in a really small company, founder-led sales. And the next step up from that, it's your initial sales hires. And what you're trying to get is a documentable, repeatable process where you can continue to grow and add more team members and add more team leaders and managers, and your results will continue to scale in the same way that they're currently scaling. So you have predictable, scalable, predictable revenue growth. And in order to do that, you really need a data-driven approach. You also need to be really, really precise about who these ideal clients are. A lot of it, I think, for companies too that are co-location operators specifically is it depends on how close you are to your clients. A lot of times, especially with relatively small operators, when they struggle to scale their marketing and sales plan, I see this infatuation with channel partners or commission only brokers. And in most cases, it's not so much a matter that they're going to hire a channel chief or hire a broker or something like that and really learn what's working and scale that over time. It's usually more a matter of desperation. They're trying to find someone that's unsophisticated enough to take on that assignment that doesn't realize that the proper foundation hasn't been put in place yet. In other words, premature, hate to use the phrase like premature abdication, premature delegation, premature channelization, channel partnerization, something along those lines. But yeah, it's super, super important if you're going to prevent these 40% shortfalls or if you really want to have good clarity around the key levers and dials in your business, it's not going to be found by initially trying to throw together at the last minute an ad hoc commission only sales program or channel partner program. It's going to come from first having your own efforts at lead generation and nurturing and figuring out what the different deal stages are, to the point where like you go into your CRM and you're like, okay, if prospect demonstrates this behavior, they're 20% through. If prospect hits this next milestone, they're 40% through. So you can literally take like the estimated deal size and forecasted close date and the probability for each of those deal stages, and you really, really know what's going on at a deep level. With commission only salespeople, with brokers, with channel partners, there's a really good chance that you're getting almost none of that visibility. And that's a potentially enormous problem. Another problem that comes along with depending entirely on third parties as opposed to building it yourself first is expectations. What kinds of things are being said to your prospects and clients to get them to close at all costs that could end up setting your company up for a lot of brand damage, reputational damage down the road. So if there's this really, really big shortfall of underutilized capacity, the inclination may be to reach out to every Tom, Dick, and Harriet you can find to get someone to take on that space, kind of like the Grouponization of colocation, where you're dumping your surplus inventory on like a Black Friday clearance, all rack space must go. But that's definitely not the way to build a solid, stable business. So a lot of these problems with expectations management starts with bad modeling, like all the way up at between your sales leader and your finance leader as to what needs to happen with a hiring plan and what the comp plan looks like and what behaviors are being motivated with the comp plan and what ramp time looks like and whether you have a scalable, repeatable process. All of that makes an enormous, enormous difference. So when it comes to marketing and selling, just capacity in general, this isn't much different than any other ordinary playbook for infrastructure as a service and data center solutions. Is, for starters, are you selling infrastructure as a service and data center solutions to the exact same kind of client? In other words, can both of those lines of business be carried with a single ideal client profile? Can they both be carried by the same marketing and sales teams with largely the same marketing and sales playbooks? Or do you need to run it as two distinctly different lines of business? That will make an enormous difference. And only you can answer that. You're typically going to have to see the reps. You're going to have to see like where you've been most successful. When somebody looks at your case studies page or looks at your logos or looks at your closed won, your existing customers that are sitting in your CRM system, are they all the same? Or do you find really big distinctive differences in the profile, in the ideal client profile, in the demographics essentially, and the behaviors across those two different lines of business? Once you have clarity on that, it's down to like in those kinds of accounts, who are the key people? And in those key people, what do they care about? How can we show up early and often so we exude our expertise around infrastructure and data center solutions, and we motivate those targeted buyer personas to want to spend a ton of time with our client-facing team members in their early and middle stages of their research and decision-making process, not just the tail end. A lot of people mistakenly believe that if they get contact at the tail end, that everything's going to be great. The problem is, in a self-driven buyer's journey, where 83% of the researching, comparing options, and decision making is happening before you're in the room. If you don't have a creative way to show up as the teacher, as the consultant, as the subject matter expert, as the educator, as the thought leader, it's a very, very uphill battle to change people's minds if you didn't make a really strong brand impression during a lot of those first 28 touch points of the buyer's journey. So for a lot of companies that struggle with this kind of thinking, these are cultural changes. So in other words, getting your marketing and sales team in a room pointing fingers at each other and yelling at each other is not going to solve this. This is a culture problem for a lot of companies. And the reason why it's a culture problem is a lot of the playbook that you may be using may have been fantastic throughout the early 2000s and deep into the 2010s, but we now live in a world where buyer behaviors are very, very different. And if you're still marketing and selling the same way you did 5, 10 years ago or more, you may be running out of steam a lot more rapidly than you think. It's interesting when you look at even the demographics of your target buyer personas. I am Gen X, and I interact with a lot of people that are millennials and a lot of people that are Gen Z and even some baby boomers. And I can tell you that in this industry, the baby boomers that are still actively working are all super comfortable using LinkedIn. They're all very comfortable going to webinars and speaking at webinars and being interviewed on podcasts. So I have no idea when I see people using a playbook that they haven't touched in 10 years, who the heck they think they're marketing to, because even the edge cases are far more digitally savvy than their plans and their investments are likely accounting for. So your brand is no longer limited to your logos and your hexadecimal colors and your fonts. Your brand is now everything that the marketplace says about your company when you're not in the room. And given that you're hardly in the room for much of the buyer's journey anymore, it is incredibly important that we figure out a way to get you back into the room for marketing and selling infrastructure and data center solutions. And the way we get you back in the room is we need to do a radical makeover of your client-facing team members so that they're able to provide so much value to your prospects and clients that your prospects and clients actually want to spend time with them. So they're not begging and manipulating and trying to cajole their way into these pitch meetings that have them treading water immediately. A lot of it, again, comes down to studying the heck out of the client insights, what's going on in their companies, what's going on in their teams, what's going on individually that they're trying to achieve, that they're struggling to achieve, and figuring out a way to show up early and often. And both of those are super important so that we spend a lot of time with our target clients when it matters most, not just at the tail end. By default, if you have a really big booth at a conference, you're counting on the fact that getting in there somehow, way, shape, or form is better than nothing. But the problem is many times it's either too early or it's too late, because it's really, really hard to get the timing perfect if you're not taking a midterm to long-term perspective on all this and recognizing that whether you're in on those 28 touch points or not, there's going to be 25 or 30 touch points. There's going to be an awareness stage. There's going to be a consideration stage. There's going to be a decision stage. And showing up only during the decision stage is definitely not doing you any favors. That's likely a big part of the reason why 40% of your space is empty. So at the end of the day, it's a matter of realizing that the world has changed. It's not just that AI and high performance computing and supercomputing are driven, in density and power scarcity are driven these changes. There's also been really big changes in how your buyers, their preferences, how they're researching and making their purchases. The better job you can do with adapting your sales and marketing and your go-to-market playbook to reflect how they actually are buying as opposed to how you wish they would buy, the better job you're going to do at preventing this in the first place. So that's how I would approach how a infrastructure as a service company and a data center solution provider company can market and sell its 40% underutilized capacity, so that there doesn't end up being 40% underutilized capacity that puts you in a desperation point of being forced to discount and kind of fire sale the whole thing out. Next question up is, how do we market data center managed integration and cybersecurity services? That sounds like a pretty broad line of business. How do we market data center managed services, integration services, and cybersecurity services? In a perfect world, you likely are selling all four of those kinds of services to the same kind of clients. But what that means by definition is you're going to run a pretty heavy sales process. And you're going to need really, really well-skilled sales development reps, business development reps, and account executives to be able to pull that off, especially in today's world where so much of their research and decision-making happens without sales contact. So what that means to successfully market data center services, managed services, integration services, and cybersecurity services is you essentially need to make sure that most of your client-facing team members are comfortable at least an intermediate level of proficiency, conversational proficiency in all four of those areas. It changes the nature of who you hire going forward. It changes the nature of the kind of investments that you're going to need to make in upskilling and professional development and cross-training going forward. Because without those kinds of investments, the reality is your prospects and clients really are not going to have much of an incentive or desire to spend much time with members of your client-facing team anymore. They just don't need them like that anymore if they're not able to operate more like consultants and trusted advisors. So when I talk with people that are running sales organizations in data center operators and technology companies, especially, what I tend to find is that the sales teams that are flourishing, their kind of profile for the candidate that's doing best long-term now is technical enough that they could, in a nights and weekends project, moonlight as a fractional CTO to small and mid-sized businesses. That doesn't mean they need to be a super deeply niched expert in all four of those areas across data center, managed services, integration, and cybersecurity services, but they should be at a strong advanced beginner to intermediate level, cross-discipline in all of those areas. Because without that, how are they ever going to hold down a realistic conversation with the holy grail of who they're trying to get to, which in most cases for all four of those categories is an IT executive. And depending on the size of your target company, it could be a mid-level IT executive, it could be a CTO, it could be a CIO. Think long and hard about what the incentive is for a CIO or CTO to take a meeting with someone that you just hired right out of college, who's never had a job in a professional services firm before and doesn't know squat about any of those four areas and just started to learn a little bit about data centers like 2 weeks ago. And you told them to go call as high as possible and shake the tree as hard as possible to get meetings. Why on earth would a CTO want to spend time unless they're mentoring and totally giving back? They're not going to get any value. Conversely, it's exceptionally important to have this approach where you can actually strongly deliver value. Does that mean that everyone on your team needs to be an industry veteran, 10 plus years of experience, cross-discipline across all these areas? No. However, if you want to flip the switch so that you get out of the vendor box, so that your prospects and clients see value in spending time with your client-facing team members, you really do need to think about a radical repositioning. Does this mean you should immediately go into the job title on your email signatures and LinkedIn profiles and on your business cards and do a find and replace? If only if it was that simple. The reality is, in the self-driven buyer's journey, where people can get instant answers to information without even having to type it anymore by just hitting a button and talking to Siri or Alexa or Copilot or ChatGPT or Perplexity or Claude or Gemini, whatever, there's no reason for someone to take a meeting anymore where you show up and read them your website or you read them what's on the slides. What they really, really need is for someone to work with them that has worked with dozens of other clients and dozens of similar stakeholders, who sees the pattern recognition, who knows that when it comes to a mid-market manufacturing company in the Midwestern United States or Northern England or Scandinavia or whatever it is, because you've seen the pattern recognition over and over again, the CTO typically cares about these 3, 4, 5 different areas when it comes to managed services, cybersecurity integration, and cybersecurity integration, managed services, and data center related services. And the better job you can do of understanding that path that kind of stakeholder goes through, all 28 of those touch points, the more you can guide them to the next logical step. And the same kind of person that goes in and gets these meetings also recognizes that for those 4 kinds of services, the IT executive often is the lead, but the finance person or a compliance person is usually not far behind. And the finance person or the compliance person cares about quite different issues. We need to know what those issues are, and your team members need to be trained on being a valuable guide for that. So what this comes down to is largely to be able to continue resonating and getting out of the commodity broker business. Your team members will almost certainly need to specialize, because they can't be an expert on 14 different vertical markets in 37 different geographies for 32 different kinds of company sizes. So the better job you can do at dialing in that ideal client profile and getting really specific about the target account list and who the case studies are, the use cases, the proof of concepts are, the better job you can do with making sure that you're staffing up your sales organization, your marketing organization, your account managers, your products with people that have a really good chance of succeeding, because they're bringing strong domain knowledge with them at the intersection of solving business challenges for a specific target client. That's really the unlock with all of this, is marketing data center managed integration and cybersecurity services, is being super aware of who that ideal client is, who the most important stakeholders are, what their biggest goals and challenges are, and building a plan for publishing and promoting and distributing educational resources and inviting those same people to educational events, both virtual events and in-person events, where they get a ton of value out of spending time with members of your team. So much so that they don't feel a lot of need to spend time with members from your competitors' teams, because they're learning so much from your team. And when you do that really, really well, you'll nearly guarantee that you stay on the short list. When you do that exceptionally well at a world-class level, your prospects and clients will spend so much time with members of your sales team that competitors will start to drop off the short list, because it becomes painfully obvious to those prospects and clients that no one can hold a candle to the value that you've already demonstrated during the sales process, because your sales process is so exceptionally valuable to that particular stakeholder and that kind of client that it feels like they're getting $1,000 an hour or your local currency equivalent consulting. It feels like they've engaged PwC or EY or Deloitte or KPMG, like Big Four kind of consulting. When you're able to do that at scale and build a playbook against it, the magic starts to happen with your marketing, with your lead generation, with your nurturing, with your sales enablement, and ultimately with your retention. Because we all know across all of those categories, data center, managed, integration, and cybersecurity, a lot of retention problems and a lot of retention opportunities start long before the client is ever signed up. So build the foundation the right way. You're in it for the long haul. You want clients that are in it for the long haul. Get this right, because there really isn't a lot of alternative unless you truly believe that the sales playbook is going to roll back to how it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. In other words, dig out the phone books, go get the fax modems, power up the BlackBerries. If you truly believe that, then you can probably ignore what I've been talking about for the last several minutes. But if you're painfully aware of how much the journey has changed, and you see that going forward, it is incredibly important to get out of the vendor box and not just be peddling a commodity, it's incredibly important for your client-facing team members to get that super important makeover. So when it comes to data centers and managed services and integration services and cybersecurity services, that the amount of value and expertise that you're getting from your client-facing team pre-sales and post-sales is just off the charts, incomparable. And it just plants a flag in the ground that says we are the definitive experts about anything and everything going forward for this particular ideal client profile in a certain geographic region, at a certain company size, in a certain kind of industry or vertical business, and our expertise on what we do best. So that's how I would approach how to market data center, managed integration, and cybersecurity services. And with that, we're going to take a quick break for a message from our sponsor.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We are all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. And you're watching our weekly live show, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. And if you're getting good value from today's episode, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic, for a challenge you're running up against, for a question that you'd like us to address in an upcoming episode, make sure to add that into the comments, and we'll consider adding it to the queue for an upcoming episode. So what's up next? Next question is, how does an IT infrastructure solutions company attract larger customers? How can an IT infrastructure solutions company attract larger customers? That's a fantastic question. And it's one that I hear quite a bit from companies that sell digital infrastructure. So let's first get really specific about what we mean by larger customers. And for that, as you've likely heard me talk about in the past, we need to get really specific on your ideal client profile, your ICP. Where are they located geographically? What is their size in terms of number of employees, headcount, as it's sometimes called, or perhaps even revenue? When it comes to using like LinkedIn Sales Navigator, LinkedIn Campaign Manager, ZoomInfo, any one of a dozen different companies that we could do prospecting through, well, at some point, need to get really dialed into who these larger customers are, where they're located, and how big or how small they are. I think like Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold. What's the minimum size? How many employees does a larger customer need to have to be considered a larger customer at the low end? And what's so big that they may be not practical for us to work with at this point because they would do what we would do in-house, or they'd be looking for a global provider who can service them at a completely different level. So in order to get everyone on the same page across your whole go-to-market team, across marketing, sales, account management, your product, your channel partnerships, your executive, your board, CFO, whoever else is involved in these kind of conversations, document that ideal client profile, document by what you mean by larger. Minimum number of employees, maximum number of employees, have that range really tightly dialed in. Also, when it comes to infrastructure solutions, many times there are compliance issues that are unique to a particular geographic market and a certain kind of business model or certain kind of industry. So if there's places where you know you can win, certain like healthcare, maybe you do really well in, financial services or manufacturing, maybe you do really well in, especially regulated industries like government, education, get those in your ideal client profile. And then by extension, companies that don't fit in there may not be the ones that you want to target for getting those attracting larger customers. So once we have that documented, your ideal client profile, then go and build a target account list of companies that meet that criteria. Who are these larger customers? What's their company name? What's their domain? What's their LinkedIn company page? Where are they located? How many employees do they actually have? 4, 5, 6 columns that you would find in a target account list. And depending on the nature of your geographic coverage, your company size, it could be anywhere from a couple dozen companies, it could be a few thousand companies, but more than likely there should be a defined, documented, not only ideal client profile, but target account list of who these larger customers are. Then in order to attract them, we have to get really specific on who the people are that we're actually trying to attract in these companies. The larger the company is, the more important it is that we prioritize and we pick our battles about who we're actually trying to engage with. And enterprise customers, you will find that there are actually people with infrastructure in their job title. In more mid-sized companies, you'll find that infrastructure is usually wrapped into either network engineering or network operations, or maybe an even broader IT kind of job. So depending on how big these larger customers are, you may need a more granular set of buyer personas, a more granular segmentation strategy. But at the end of the day, look at where you've done best. Look at your case studies, look at your logos, look at your CRM, and figure out what your best clients all have in common. And at those best clients, who are the key people? that you built a relationship with both pre-sales and post-sales, where it was super important for you to educate and build trust with. Because in order for us to develop a client cloning machine of your best clients, we need to be that specific on who that ideal stakeholder is, who's going to be on the committee. There may be a second kind of stakeholder, perhaps even a third kind of stakeholder, a secondary buyer persona, maybe even a tertiary buyer persona kind of person that shows up on the decision committee. Once we know who those people are, we need to know what they care about in their own words. What's the consensus on their goals? What are the biggest professional goals that they need to achieve individually, as a team, as a company, at the intersection of IT infrastructure? And what's driving them nuts? What are they struggling with? What are their biggest challenges when it comes to IT infrastructure for each of those kinds of buyer personas? Once we understand the consensus on the goals and challenges in their own words is incredibly important. Not what you think those words are, but what words actually come out of their mouth, because we need to make sure that our website copywriting and our sales enablement, our prospecting, all that stuff needs to really, really resonate to be their exact words, not what we're guessing those words are, but what the words actually are. So doing the actual research, the interviews, the surveys, studying their LinkedIn profiles, all of that is incredibly important to getting the consensus on the people at these larger customers that you want to ultimately be able to market and sell infrastructure to. And from there, from those buyer personas, you'll be able to back into a content calendar, copywriting for your website. You'll be able to figure out like what educational events would look like, what the titles are, what the bullet points are, what you're going to cover in virtual events, what you're going to cover in in-person events, for anything and everything that's important to your most important stakeholders about IT infrastructure. And then we need to make sure that you're able to show up in a way that adds value to their professional lives, oozes value, exudes value at a level like that just causes their jaw to drop at how incredibly valuable the insights and educational resources are that you're sharing with them. If you have that talent in-house, fantastic. If you don't have that talent in-house, you need to go get that talent, either by bringing in guest speakers or partnering with some other company that you work with or something. But at the end of the day, it's incredibly important that if you want these larger customers for IT infrastructure, everything that you do with your messaging and communication needs to be all about them. Not what you'd like them to care about, what they actually do care about in their own words. And the better job you can do at that, the more likely it is that you're going to attract those larger customers for your IT infrastructure. Again, as client-centric as possible. Not what you want to sell them, but what they care about. Because the goal is to get in early and get in often. Think about like 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. Most of the companies that you compete with that are asleep at the wheel on this, maybe they get in, if they're lucky, for 2 or 3 or 4 of those 28 touch points. You're not going to be like that now going forward, because you understand that in the self-driven buyer's journey, your brand is everything that the marketplace says about your company when you're not in the room. And given that you're hardly in the room for any of the time anymore, you're typically only going to be in the room, best case scenario, for the last 17% of the buyer's journey. We can't allow that to stand. You'll be way too marginalized if you just accept the default plan with all this. We need to say nonsense. We're going to get back in the room by being incredibly relevant to who they are and what they care most about, so that instead of showing up as account executives and sales development reps, we show up as teachers and consultants and trusted advisors and subject matter experts on IT infrastructure for this kind of company and these kind of stakeholders in a particular geographic region at a certain company size. And the more hyper specific we are with our educational resources and their educational events, the more it is incredibly difficult for those right stakeholders to ignore what you're bringing to the table, because they're learning so much that there's really no reason for them to want to go outside elsewhere and learn from anyone else. That's when you start to monopolize as many of those 28 touch points as possible. And not only are you staying on the short list, by doing an exceptionally good job with that, you start to knock the competitive alternatives off of the short list, because it becomes painfully obvious that no one's going to hold a candle to the expertise that you're already demonstrating with your client-facing team. So that's how an IT infrastructure solutions company can attract larger customers. Next question up is, how does a data center construction company connect with digital infrastructure decision makers? How does a data center construction company connect with digital infrastructure decision makers? This is a great question. And it's one I actually wish that more construction companies would actually ask, as opposed to this being a rather unusual question that we've received. Why do I say that? Because in the 10 years that I've been working in and around this space, historically, the operators, the data center operators and the data center technology companies have typically led the charge when it comes to really, really good content marketing, really good thought leadership, publishing and promoting digital media, all those related topics. Facilities related companies would probably be a close second or third place on that. And then there's usually a pretty big drop off where we see that there are some construction companies and some real estate related companies in and around digital infrastructure who've done a reasonably good job of keeping up with modern buyer preferences. But if there actually was a category of laggards in data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, it typically is the category of the construction and the real estate related companies, which is a shame because the exact people that they want to reach are the same, largely a lot of the same kinds of people that are also buyers of operator related services and technology and facilities, or at least their coworkers. And they largely have the same digital preferences now, where they're spending most of their time researching and pairing options before they are ready to get to the point of a sales conversation. But everyone knows when it comes to business transformation and digital transformation, the people part is the hardest part. But if you're a sufficiently motivated executive at a construction company who sincerely wants to connect with digital infrastructure decision makers, it's a pretty straightforward path. You just need to be realistic that although you're one of the earlier ones in your category to get in there, your buyers are typically already very, very deeply have very deeply ingrained expectations of what great educational content resources, what great thought leadership resources look like, because they get that from everywhere else in the data center ecosystem already. So let's think about what your playbook should look like, as long as you have reasonable expectations on playing catch up with all this and recognizing that there's a lot of competition for people's attention. So when it comes to digital infrastructure decision makers, let's look at where you've been most successful. Construction companies are typically either general contractors or specialty contractors. And depending on the nature of your business model, there are different kinds of stakeholders that you need to educate and build trust with. The way you'll know for your particular business model who the most important digital infrastructure decision makers are is to look at your historical patterns, look at your case studies, look at your logos, look in your customer relationship management system, and figure out who are the typical people that are at the table with you pre-sales and post-sales, and who are the happiest long-term. For construction companies, sometimes they're marketing direct to developers, sometimes they're marketing direct to investors, sometimes they're marketing direct to portfolio people at venture capital, private equity, kind of the capital side. And in some cases, they're also marketing to specialty contractors within the space. Again, what's going to work best for you, it really depends on how generalized or specialized your company is, and how big or small your company is, and how big or small your target clients are. But if you were looking strictly for digital infrastructure decision makers, you need to be specific about who these digital infrastructure decision makers actually are. Because for like an operator or a technology company, if you went and you looked at LinkedIn for people that have infrastructure in their job title, that are an IT job title, it's very likely that those folks are really much later in the life cycle than you want to be building relationship with. They're dealing with the data center has been built out, it's been commissioned, it's up and running. Now these are the people that deal with network infrastructure, telecommunications, cybersecurity, all that stuff on a regular basis. A construction company is typically getting involved 6, 12, 18 months before that ever happened. So your stakeholders are going to be a little different. So these could be digital infrastructure investors. These could be commissioning companies. Again, your pattern is going to be a little different than everyone else's. In some cases, it's site selection experts. In some cases, it's design build companies, it's architects. But just recognize that getting that right is incredibly important, because the more hyper specific you can be about who your ideal client is, where they're located geographically, their company size, the business model, and who the unique stakeholders are, what those unique stakeholders care most about, you're going to be way more successful with connecting with the right people, as opposed to people that are tangential or adjacent to the right people. Recognize too that there's no such thing as really an individual decision maker anymore, because even if you manage to get to the person who's going to be the final sign off, people have gotten so risk averse that they're going to just kick it back to their team. Their team say, go meet with them, go figure out, like they'll go over the specs, they'll go over what they're actually looking for. And if you can build consensus with them, loop me back in and we'll talk about potentially working together. So the sales cycles are getting longer, the decision committees are getting bigger, and it's more important than ever for a company that does construction in and around digital infrastructure, data centers, critical facilities, to get really, really deep into understanding who their ideal clients are and who the stakeholders are that they need to be building relationships with. And then instead of just showing up as a vendor or showing up as a construction company, you want to show up more as like a teacher, as a consultant, or as a trusted advisor about anything and everything that has to do with digital infrastructure, construction related knowledge that they need to have to be successful with their kind of initiative. How do you know what they need to be successful? Because you look at the pattern recognition with having worked with similar kinds of stakeholders in similar kinds of companies like that in the past. And okay, this is what happens at step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, all the way through to step 28. And at each of those touch points, you have an idea of what that touch point should look like to be able to provide strong educational value to those particular kinds of digital infrastructure decision makers. Because you've seen the pattern recognition, and you are able to not only accelerate sales cycles by anticipating what they want to know next, but you're able to build a deep emotional bond with them as you educate and build trust with them over and over and over again throughout their full buyer's journey. And when you do this really, really well, they end up spending most of the buyer's journey with members of your client-facing team, which essentially starves out oxygen from your competitors. So not only are you on the short list, but the emotional bond of educating and building trust with the right people, with these decision makers, can be exceptionally potent, not only in how they frame the criteria that they use to evaluate all the different options, but just on a personal level of getting the inside track on what's going on and staying with them, not only on the short list, but in many cases, you're starting to neutralize competitive options that are on the short list to make it far, far easier for you to advance the sale when they're finally ready to have that sales kind of conversation. So the reality is, sure, it's a different business model, and the topics and the buyer personas are a little different, but it's the same basic methodology. Recognizing that most people don't want to spend a lot of time with your sales team anymore until they're almost ready to buy. So in order to get back in and enjoy the kind of seat at the table that most of your sales team used to be able to have 10 years ago, it's a readjustment process. It's a repositioning process. It's having members of your client-facing team, your sales, your marketers, your project manager, whoever else was typically involved early on, having them show up in more of an educational expertise role, consulting kind of role, so that it feels like it's exceptionally valuable to your prospects and clients. They actually want to spend time with members of your team as opposed to chasing and begging for meetings all day long. So that's the general approach. From a tactical perspective, LinkedIn is incredibly important. Content and events are incredibly important for construction projects, especially visual content, video content is incredibly important. Firsthand accounts and case studies, interviews of existing clients are incredibly important. This is the same playbook that, again, the operators and the technology companies and even the facilities companies have been largely doing for 10 years. So if you're completely starting from scratch and you don't have this talent in-house, there's a lot of good sector, silos, segments, whatever, within digital infrastructure, critical facilities, data centers, where you can find this talent. But make no mistake, your buyers have changed. Their preferences have changed for how they are researching and making these decisions. The stakeholders that are on these committees are wired a little differently than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And the question is, are you showing up in a way that is helping you to not only connect, but it positions you in a way that you're able to educate and build trust with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so that they see your client-facing team members as the be-all end-all experts about anything and everything that has to do with data center construction for digital infrastructure. That brings us to our last question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's episode, make sure that you hit the like button. So what's the final question? How does an IT infrastructure provider get more leads and grow its sales funnel? How does an IT infrastructure provider get more leads and grow its sales funnel? That's a great question. And what it largely comes down to is we need to understand what a good lead looks like. In other words, if we reverse engineer where a company has been most successful in the past with selling IT infrastructure, what do those folks have in common? Where are they located? How big or small are their companies? Are there certain industries or business models or segments that we do better than others? All of that should get baked into your ideal client profile. From there, you can build a target account list. And then we start to figure out what a good lead is going to look like. And in order to understand what a good lead looks like, we need to understand that it's not just a name of a person and a company anymore. We need to figure out a way to show up in a way where they see us as experts on IT infrastructure. They see us as consultants. They see us as trusted advisors. Because in a self-driven buyer's journey, which is the world we now live in, and it's unlikely to ever roll backwards, most of the journey is over before people are ready, before prospects are ready to have a conversation with a member of your sales team. Like 83% of their journey is over. That's Gartner's number. Before they're ready for sales contact. This is very different than as recently as 10 years ago, where your sales team used to be able to spend about half of their journey, half of the sales cycle with prospects and clients. Those days are gone. In order for us to show up early and often in the right context, we need to rethink what it means to have a lead. In most cases, the goal is to intercept people as early as possible in their journey so that they spend a lot of those 28 touch points throughout the full journey, throughout awareness and consideration with members of our client-facing team. In order to do that, we have to think about what kind of value we can provide to these leads so that they're motivated to want to spend time with members of our team. And in order to do that, we need to get really specific about who they are, what they care about, what their biggest goals are, what their biggest challenges are, and how we can deliver strong professional educational value to them that motivates them to want to spend time with members of our client-facing team. Because by default, most companies that you compete with are incredibly self-absorbed and incredibly selfish when it comes to trying to force these conversations onto prospects and clients, which means that if you're able to show a reasonable amount of empathy, of walking a mile or a kilometer in their shoes and understand what they're actually going through in their job, what their goals are, what their team's goals are, what their company's goals are, and what they're struggling with the most, to the extent that you're able to show up as a resource that helps them close the gap on what's necessary to get to their IT infrastructure goals and solve some of the IT infrastructure problems that are messing with their work-life balance, that are screwing up their vacations, that are causing all kinds of cultural problems internally within the company where no one's really happy about the state of IT infrastructure. To the extent that you're able to show up and introduce them to a better way of looking at things, asking, not only answering the questions they have, but answering the questions that they should be asking 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps down the road. Not only does that help tremendously with sales cycle acceleration, it builds a strong emotional bond where they see your team more as educators and subject matter experts rather than a traditional IT infrastructure vendor. The good part is, from your perspective, a lot of the companies that you compete with haven't gotten the memo on this and are still selling the same way they did 10 years ago. But that gap is not going to exist for long. Most companies are figuring out that they're banging their head against the wall using an outdated playbook that pretends as if like 90% of the decision makers are Gen X and baby boomers. We know that with 10,000 baby boomers a day retiring, we know that the early 2020s with millions of people working home, accelerating digital transformation. We know with more millennials and Gen Z and even alphas and Gen Alphas moving into decision committees, we need to adjust to the way that modern buyers are researching and comparing their options for digital infrastructure. So if you're serious about getting more leads and growing your sales funnel, We need to understand what they care about, and all of our lead generation offers, all of our lead nurturing offers, all of our educational events need to zero in on what's most important to them and providing exceptionally strong value that motivates your prospects and clients to want to spend time with members of your team. So that's the unlock for better downloadable content. That's the unlock for better webinars, better educational events, better lunch and learns, better all of the above, is getting super specific on who they are, what they care about, what's driving them nuts, and figure out a way with education and consulting and subject matter expertise to demonstrate extreme value so that they want to spend as much time with your team as possible, because they're learning how they can get to a better place with achieving their IT infrastructure goals and addressing some of their biggest things that are driving them nuts about their existing IT infrastructure. So that's how an IT infrastructure provider can get more leads and grow its sales funnels. Extreme empathy for your most important buyer personas at the right kinds of companies, and showing up in a way where you basically have a sales transformation, a sales makeover, so that you're coming up with much better synonyms than what's currently in your email signature, on your LinkedIn profile, and on your business card for the job titles. And you can't just give lip service to doing a find every place on these job titles. These are cultural changes. It changes the nature of who you hire. It changes the nature of where you make your professional development investments. It changes the nature of your upskilling. And for most companies in and around IT infrastructure, your client-facing team members should have a strong enough skill set that it feels like nights and weekends they could go out there and hang out their shingle as a fractional CTO for small and medium-sized businesses. That's what I'm seeing over and over and over again among IT infrastructure companies and data center operators when I talk with sales leaders and members of their sales team. So that's how a IT infrastructure provider can get more leads and grow their sales funnel. So that's the final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We're all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. If you found this week's episode useful, interesting, and helpful, make sure that you hit the like button. Feel free to drop a comment if you have a topic that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, and to make sure that you get notified about upcoming events and educational resources like this, be sure to subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. Look forward to seeing you back again next week. Enjoy the rest of your week as we head down the home stretch on our quarter, our year, and wishing you great success in growing your role, your team's role, and your company's role in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.